Hi, everyone. Today's class is going to be all about ethics and IRB approval and thinking about how you can anticipate risks that might come up, how you can build in measures into your design to ensure that you're protecting participants and honoring your power as the researcher. So thinking about the objectives, both for this lecture and the readings that you will do after, it's important that you are able to conceptualize ethics beyond just forms and approvals. And hopefully in this lecture, I can give you some insight into the IRB process so you can start to think about that and streamline your design with that as an ultimate goal. And within that, understanding informed consent as more than just the form, but as this dynamic relational process. Start to think about ethical dilemmas and risks that could come up and learn about some strategies that you can do to help you mitigate those risks. And then, of course, situate the power and positionality and reciprocity that you are coming into this research project with to really center relationships, make sure that you're honoring cultural context, and that you are planning for the critical role of reflexivity. So when we think about ethics as relational, I'm pulling from both the Marshall text and Ravitch chapter 11, which of course is linked if you are curious in checking that out. But understanding ethics as an active process, a practice that or praxis that you engage in, and that understanding that research and particularly qualitative research is inherently relational. And so therefore these ethical practices are so important and in many ways are measured by the quality of the relationships that you have with participants. So in that, it's important that you understand the power dynamics that are inherent between you and participants and make sure that you have thought about this and you commit to an inquiry stance where you are reflexive and collaborative with participants to try to disentangle those power hierarchies as much as possible. In Ravitch's conception of ethics, she really draws on some of the learnings from feminist methodologies that emphasize the importance of dialogue between researcher and participants, co-construction of knowledge, and transformation as an ultimate goal. So that might be something that you want to build into your design as well. So in thinking about relational ethics and what the components of it are, the first one being reflexivity and this ongoing iterative process of continuous self-awareness about your own biases, your own assumptions, your own power, how you are impacting the research process. So we talked a lot about this in our last lecture too, the metaphor of looking at yourself in the mirror and all of the complexities of that process. This idea of reciprocity, engaging in careful critical engagement with what you give and with what you take. So thinking a lot about what benefits participants will get from you and what are the ethics about that and how that will impact the obligations that you promise or boundaries that you are trying to uphold to be ethical. An idea of transparency, making sure that you are clear with your participants about your goals in conducting the research, the processes you will go through, your expectations, any risks, what everyone's role is, and how data will be used. And then thinking about boundaries. So not boundaries like bounding a case when you are talking about your methodology, but boundaries in the relationships that you will establish as part of your study. So thinking about how these boundaries are contextually set and maintained. So this again goes back to your conceptual framework and your researcher positioning, how you are related to the research and your participants and what is appropriate there. And thinking about where you are in that continuum and how you will navigate. Of course, you want to avoid overly distant and then also overly intimate relationships. And again, all of this is going to be specific to your unique study, but these are some of the important things to think about when you are talking about the ethics of the relationships that you will be engaging in your data collection and beyond. So oftentimes, too often in research, and this is more common in other paradigms that are not primarily constructivist or critical, sometimes ethics can be reduced to just compliance with the IRB. And sometimes ethics can be approached in a way that is transactional or even the relationships between researcher and participants can be positioned as transactional. So it's important to move beyond that and, of course, see ethics as much more than just IRB approval, but rather seeing those as the minimum standards and understanding that you will take on much more than what IRB requires. So, in order to engage in research that is highly ethical, it requires an ongoing process, an ongoing engagement, ongoing reflection that is sensitive to your unique context, to all of the negotiating that you are doing, negotiating with participants, negotiating with sites, negotiating with knowledge production in and of itself, negotiating with how you will present research. That's so important to think about. So when you are thinking about compliance, you will have lots of issues that come up when you are completing IRB, thinking about consent, how you will go about gaining consent and maintaining consent, confidentiality and anonymity. Coming back to these ideas throughout the research, they're not really boxes to be checked off. Of course, getting your IRB approval is something that you are checking off your list. However, the principles in it are something that you are constantly negotiating throughout the process. Talked about that, only the starting point. And in doing so, think about the relational, contextual, and reflexive nature of your work. Sometimes, again, different ways, and we talked about this in last class as well. There are different conceptions, different theories, different constructs in how to talk about the quality of qualitative research. And for you, one of your values and goals might be to demonstrate quality through the relationship that you have with participants. And maybe it also has to do with how you demonstrate your understanding of power, positionality, and how that comes up. Another thing to think about is how you will protect your participants from unintentional harm. Of course, intentional harm, but much more common is unintentional harms that could come up, things that you may not initially have thought of. And so this is when dialoguing and engaging in some of those planned, structured practices can help you think about some things that could come up. So again, demands this ongoing attention, humility, and anticipation of necessary adjustments and shifts. So we've talked about how qualitative research is an emergent design and it is constantly under revision. In a sense, the design process is iterative, it is recursive, and ethics adds on another layer to this as well. Sometimes the study that you plan needs to shift because of an ethical dilemma that you encounter once you begin data collection. So anticipating that and even building it into your design can be a way to demonstrate your ethical stance. In terms of the IRB, the chapters that you read will have some overview of this. I know that you have already completed the city training and that at some point, if not soon, you will be completing your own IRB process. So it's important to think about how you will go about the informed consent process and how you will make sure that you're protecting participants, and along the way thinking about any ethical dilemmas that could arise surrounding consent that you are gaining. So thinking about, some scholars conceptualize informed consent as a conversation. Ravitch talks about it as a meaningful dialogue with participants and an ongoing process. So as far as the IRB is concerned, informed consent, you sign the form to gain consent, even though those consent forms say that participants can withdraw at any time. Good and ethical qualitative research sees consent as ongoing. So thinking about how you will not only gain consent, but how will you maintain consent and how will you ensure, or how will you demonstrate trustworthiness that not only did you gain consent ethically, but you also maintained it. So when you are coming to this, sometimes a stance of demonstrating respect for participants and maintaining consent, and considering the context that makes it appropriate and the practices that might be appropriate based on your unique study and context about gaining and maintaining consent, being responsive to culture as well. So two of the terms that are central to informed consent that you will need for your IRB application and that came up in the city training are the idea of confidentiality and anonymity. So these are often confused and conflated. So I want to make sure that you understand them so you're using them correctly in your research design and in your IRB forms. So confidentiality is when the researcher keeps participant private information private. So the participants are known to the researcher knows who they are, but the researcher maintains confidentiality by making sure that they are keeping their identifiable information private. And when they share the results, they remove any identifiable information. Now, anonymity is when the researcher does not know the participant. So in most qualitative research, we have confidentiality and not anonymity. If you're doing interviews or focus groups, it's not possible to be anonymous in almost every case because you are the one face to face or even via phone with the participant. So there are many different strategies to protect participants, and based on your unique design and context, there will be some that are specific to you as well. One of the common practices in qualitative research is the use of pseudonyms, and using pseudonyms consistently throughout data collection and analysis, and even in the raw data as well. Sometimes that is common. Removing identifiable details, and you'll read some anecdotes in the text about some times when when confidentiality was accidentally breached. And so it's important to think about what type of identifying details might come up in your study and how you will go about dealing with them. Having careful data storage and being explicit about who will have access to data. And we talked about this in terms of AI, and will AI have access to your data? In terms of power, this brings in the practice of reflexivity and how you can navigate your positionality and establish boundaries to really foster this dynamic and relational stance towards ethics. So all researchers, even grad students, have an element of institutional power because we are choosing what questions to ask, what data we're going to consider, and what data to feature in our written reports. Also, what participants are included, what participants are not included, what voices we highlight. There's so many different choices that we make as researchers that are filled with power. So in understanding that, it's important for us to come to our work with a responsibility and understand the responsibility that we hold in interpreting and representing participants' words in a way that is honoring. And so a way to deal with this is reflexivity. And so Ravage conceptualizes it as an ethical responsibility to critically explore our own positionalities. So some of the questions that you can plan into your design, this is called structured reflexivity, is you might ask, what are my social identities? How do they shape my research? How do you see your participants? We talked about the researcher continuum. How do you view yourself? But how do you view participants? Are they partners? Are they data sources? Are they informants? And what does that say about your ethical responsibility? And where might your interpretations impose your worldview? Thinking about that in your interpretation of data. I think that this is so important, and not only researcher, but in life and policy and everything, teaching, everything. Good intentions are not enough. We're responsible for more than our intentions, because we are also responsible for unintended consequences of our work. And so it's important to think critically about how your work is used, how your position shapes it, and how you will engage with this in an ongoing way. In terms of boundaries, again, that is very much tied to the context of your study and the relationship that you have with not only your participants, but the setting and the research in general. We talked about that, not over-promising, and then also not being too detached, and thinking about how you will withdrawal in an ethical way from your research, how you will end it. And the overpromising can be more common, especially with graduate students who are maybe under deadline pressure to finish a dissertation. And so making sure that you actually write it out. Careful planning can help you avoid some of these mistakes. So when you plan out how you will go about selecting participants, how you will go about gaining consent, how you will go about establishing trust, when you make a plan for that, that can help you avoid some of the overpromising. Okay, so some of the challenges that could come up when you share personal contact information, it could lead to blurred roles. And of course, this depends on the specifics of your research. This example is likely from when the researcher doesn't know the participant outside of the study. But thinking about blurred roles that could come up, over-promising in terms of collaboration, even if there's elements of your research that are participatory, making sure that you're not over-promising that, or that you're promising deliverables that cannot be sustained. The idea of reciprocity, negotiating carefully gifts. And this is something that you will also include in your IRB, but thinking about that. Making sure that you have that transparency about data use, that you are transparent about how participant voice will be included in analysis and dissemination, and thinking about how you can acknowledge participants' contributions. And along with that, avoiding positioning yourself as a savior in terms of how you present participant responses. For those of you who are coming to this from a collaborative or participatory nature, it might be important to you to position collaboration as an ethical stance. And for instance, you might say that you are coming into collaboration as a reciprocal, reflective process, and talk about how that is going to relate to the co-creation of knowledge and how you are using this to challenge traditional power hierarchies, and how you are willing to be vulnerable and accept critique and criticism from your participants if that is part of your design. Okay, so I do want to talk to you a little bit about the technical of IRB. So this is the IRB website through Georgia State, where you will go about completing your IRB proposal once you are at that time. So before doing this, you have completed your city training. Everyone here has already done that, so make sure that is current. Well, that's the required training. Check you've done that. So you will develop a login that is your Panther ID that you use for everything. Now, once you are there, here are some of the materials that you will need. So you will need an IRB application. And I do have a sample here in the slides. If you want to see an example of an application that I completed and submitted and was approved, to get an idea of what kinds of questions you will be asked and what kind of responses are appropriate for IRB. You'll need to include your recruitment materials, whether it's an email, whether it is not a flyer. I don't think anyone's going to use a flyer anymore, but maybe it's a posting on a website, what you will use to recruit participants. Site approval letters. If you are planning to do this on site, you need those first before you can do the IRB. You will need your informed consent document. So I do have a sample here. However, once you get logged on to IRB, they have their own templates that you must use, and it must follow their guidelines. So this one is a few years old, so make sure you use their updated version. If you are including children, you might need an assent form or a script. There's an example of what that could look like. You also need a research protocol. So all of your work in this class could likely lead to your research protocol. You also need patience and diligence because It's very common that you will get a revision and that you will need to go back and do. Also takes patience because when you are doing IRB for the first time, it is its own genre of writing. And so being as clear and concise as possible is typically the best. The being as comprehensive in as few words as possible is really helpful for IRB. And I'll show you that in the example as well. So I do recommend that you start working on the materials now so they're ready to go, particularly the research protocol. That's something you could be working on. So let me take you to what the sample looks like. So I just exported this as a PDF from my IRB site, but you will need your advisor will be your principal investigator, then you will be the contact. And then like this one is the purpose of your research, how human subjects will be involved, who will be involved in each one, and so on and so forth. So you can use this to see some of the questions, so you can start planning and you can see some of the responses that I gave here if they are helpful in how you can go about phrasing it. So that's the application. Recruitment materials. This is an example of an email that was used to recruit teachers to participate. This is a sample informed consent. Again, don't use this as a template. Use the template that you get from Georgia State IRB. And then if you're doing assent, you will need a script. Here's an example of that. And then the research protocol. Like I mentioned, this is something that you can be working on now because it has a lot of the elements that we've been working on in this class, and it's very short. So you have your project summary, general information, rationale background information, your objectives, design and methodology, data management and analysis, outcomes, dissemination of results, duration, ethics, informed consent forms, and any references. So that is an example of your research protocol that you will need to turn in. So these are in, okay, these are in a folder. I wanted to see if you have access to it. I will go ahead and link the folder, but you also have access to all of those materials there. So that is an example of what you can expect in the IRB process once you get there. And again, be simple and clear in your writing. This is going to be much different from your perspectives where you're going in depth. In your IRB, you're being simple and clear. Okay, so you in the next part of this perusal, you have um, your excerpt from Marshall. And then here are some of the articles that you can choose from to read further about ethics, something new. Many of you may have read this one, Telling Secrets, Revealing Lives. So if you've already read that, pick something else that you haven't done that is of interest, and share with the group what you thought. So for your mini memo this week, I want you to think about any ethical challenges that will come up in your work and strategies you are thinking of to manage them, and reflecting on your positionality, power, and your planned approach to how you're going to gain consent and how you are going to establish reciprocity in this relationship with your participants. I look forward to seeing your comments and perusal.